Mr. Chair, we don't contest the idea that the situation in Syria is indeed regrettable because we recognize that it's pretty horrible and inhumane down there. But we don't think that now is the right time to intervene, but we won't rule it out in the future. We think this debate takes place in the now, where we are talking about what we already know and what we can possibly foresee. Therefore, we think, given the current climate, we don't think intervention in Syria is a strategic move for the international community. We think we're going to stick with current efforts of diplomacy. We're going to stick with talks, we're going to stick with negotiations, we're going to stick with peacekeeping efforts, but we don't think that the international community can go in and instigate military action against the Assad regime. Before I go on, a few rebuttals for the previous speaker. The first thing he tells us is that let's attack this proposal, because the first thing he says that the international community has overwhelming military might. But the first response is that military might is never just a justification or even a reasonable assumption for you to win a war. We've had people win wars with much cruder weapons, like in Vietnam, due to overwhelming numbers or due to natural advantages. Because we think that's exactly the problem here in Syria, where a lot of the fighting is concentrated in the urban centers. Places where the Assad regime knows best, and places where you have the highest likelihood of civilian casualties. And we don't think it's a responsible move for us to say that it's okay to kill people on the ground. Second, they tell us that they're going to facilitate refugees at different borders. But they never prove to us that these Arab League nations are going to be willing to accept a massive exodus of people that they have to feed and clothe and protect into their lands. We think that's something that has to fly in their model. And I'm going to prove to you that these people obviously don't want that. Third thing, he tells us we're going to have UN peacekeepers. But this only works in the scenario where they have UN approval. They have to prove to us that if the UN says we don't care about the coalition, they have efforts to make sure that they can address that. Thirdly, he tells us that Assad can't rely on Iranian help anyway. We've already told you that with or without help from other countries, they already have distinct advantages and possess massive risks of collateral harm, something that any responsible actor in the international community would not risk having. Next, he told us that we're going to have defectors if we see that we're going to engage in Assad regime with international intervention. But we tell you, defectors are more likely to happen on our side. Why? We think intervention radicalizes people. We think intervention will cause more people to take up arms. These people may not necessarily be pro-Assad, but they're definitely going to be against anti-intervention, causing more people to take up arms and cause more conflict against Western troops and against civilians on the ground. But secondly, we think that when you ask people that you have to sit down and talk about these things, you make them rethink whether or not this war or this oppression that they're waging is actually worth it. So we think we actually give a better incentive for people to defect, a better incentive for people to comply with peace efforts. I'm going to argue three things to you today. First, on why war in the current context is not going to work. Second, why the coalition of the willing is virtually non-existent. Nobody is going to fight this war. And lastly, why diplomacy is the effort that we're most willing to take and why it's one that's most viable. On the first idea, why war is not going to work. But before I go on, sure.
Given that he has billions of oil dollars stashed away, what incentive does Assad have to back down?
We think, for example, that human rights violations have been committed in China, who has the largest economy in the world, lots of resources, right? But the point is, even if they're rich, over time you can get them to make concessions, like stop killing journalists, like open your markets to other countries. So we think diplomacy is reasonable. Let's weigh this later on in my third argument. Three reasons why war is not going to work. The first reason is because you can't compare this exactly to Libya. What we had in Libya were a lot of skirmishes and wars fought away from the urban centers in military strongholds in the wastelands and in the provinces. We don't think that you can have this in Syria, especially when the battlegrounds are places like Damascus and Homs where you have a high civilian concentration. And we don't think you can simply isolate the fighting there. We think it's important to consider these things because the just war theory states that one of the reasons why you go into war is you have a high reasonable probability of success. We don't think you can call it a success if you're going to have thousands of people in collateral dead at the end of the day. Second reason, we don't think we can intervene without a unified opposition. Why exactly is this important? We think we need important figures and bureaucrats to be able to take over once you settle down. So we're going to argue in a post-war scenario, something which they've never proven to us is actually going to materialize. We tell you that we have a lot, the Syrian opposition is factious. You have the Syrian Free Army, you have the Syrian National Council, you have the Syrian Transitory Council. Why is this important? Because we think they have different extents on whether or not they're willing to accept intervention, different extents as to how they foresee a particular government, and we think that without resolving these things internally, even if you do come in and intervene, you're going to have 3 new powers that are going to be fighting over the vacuum there, so what you're actually doing is making the war worse on the ground. But thirdly, even if there is a unified opposition, we think that because of its sectarian nature, these people are not going to perceive it as illegitimate. We think that a lot of these groups gain a lot of credibility from their home sects in Saudi Arabia. And whenever you prop them out officially, assuming you get the Arab League to come in, we don't think it's going to be seen as a legitimate government. It's going to be seen as an effort by the Arab League to further control and manipulate their lives. And we don't think that opposition is going to last very long. But thirdly, let's talk about geography. We think one of the biggest factors that limited the refugee exodus in Libya is that a large part of it was facing the Mediterranean Sea, right? But when you're talking about Syria, it's landlocked with countries like Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, and Israel. And we think a protracted war is going to cause a massive exodus into these countries. They have to prove to us that these people are going to risk this war with the possibility of accepting thousands and thousands of people flooding their borders, taking away security from their people, giving them more reasons as to their people questioning as to whether or not these people deserve protection in the first place. And we think more likely than not, these governments are going to side on the side of their people, telling them that we owe you our responsibility to protect you first, and we don't think we owe these refugees anything. But finally, why are we willing to go with diplomacy? We think diplomacy is a long-term effort, which is why you have a multi-year plan coming from Kofi Annan. But we think in the past, we've always had a high threshold for abandoning diplomacy, right? And we think if we throw it away right now, after 1 year after the Arab Spring, we think we're doing it a massive disservice. Because we think sanctions do work, and concessions do come from abusive governments. We've seen China relax its policies, we've seen Myanmar release Aung San Suu Kyi and actually hold free elections, even if it came grudgingly from the military junta. What does this tell you? We think you can get diplomacy to get people to change, and from the opposition side, we prefer a few hundred deaths and some concessions over a decade or two, because we can't say that these regimes are absolutely going to stop. We think maybe the atrocities will still continue, but we think without antagonizing them, they happen on a much smaller scale. Whereas what they're proposing is that you throw away diplomacy, even though you've never really given it a chance, make military intervention your first option, and have 100,000 dead people on your hands just because you were impatient for things to work, just because you wanted to come in and prove that you're right. We don't think this is a battle of who has the bigger stick. It's about a battle of seeing whether or not you can reasonably convince a military junta to put down its arms. And we think you best do that when you feed them diplomacy, and that's what you get from opposition side. Thanks.